Thanks, Rich. So I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to put those into the chat windows, and we'll get to those at the end. But just first off, let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Rob Hulting. I'll be moderating here today with Dan Wiley and Mike Sullivan. I'm the president of sales and operations here at rmsource. We're a managed service provider located right here, headquartered in downtown Raleigh, locations across Cary, Durham, and we're incorporated in Perth, Australia. So we are a managed service provider focused in MDR, EDR services, Microsoft Gold, cloud platform provider. We're also in the exhibit hall. So after the session, if for whatever reason we don't get to all the questions or things like that, Mike has agreed to actually join us in the booth after the show. So if you've got questions, please feel free to stop by after the booth. So with that said, let me go ahead and do some introductions on the folks that we've got. We're going to have a candid conversation today between Dan and Mike. Over on the rmsource side, so Mike Sullivan is the Director of Networking and Security Services here at rmsource. He's got 20 plus years working with both small, mid-sized to enterprise organizations. He helps groups with their security postures. He's got certification in CISSP, ethical hacker, NSA, you name it, all the way down the list. He's seen quite a bit and has the credentials to back it up. So over on the other side, I've got Dan Wiley, and I've noticed on the screen that it looks like it's Dan Wiley twice. So Mike, I think you're also labeled as Dan Wiley on the call for everybody today, but go ahead and wave your arms. That is Mike Sullivan over there. On the other side of the screen there, we've got Dan Wiley. Let me introduce you to him. He is the head of threat management, chief security advisor with Checkpoint Software Technologies, 25 plus years in the business. I've managed to age all of us here on this call, but our eyes have seen quite a bit with regards to security over the years, so everybody's in good hands. But he manages all the Checkpoint advanced security service teams, Checkpoint incident response teams. His core responsibilities are bridging the gaps between the product, the operational security, and providing actionable security advice to customers globally. So I want to thank Dan for joining us today, and we look forward to some good conversations moving forward. So before we start off, what I'd like to do is just, and I'll throw this one to you first, Dan. What I'd like is, let's just get kind of a state of the state. We've got a lot of stuff that's kind of going on. The FBI just talked about, new cyber threats, healthcare, things of that nature, but just a quick overview, a state of the state from the IRT perspective, real quick, and then I'll toss it to Mike to kind of add to that as well.
So absolutely happy to do that, Rob. So, 2020 has been a burning pile of garbage. I don't know how else to put that for everybody on the call. We're all sort of living through the COVID insanity, and from a cybersecurity perspective, it's equally as bad. We are on track to double our number of incidents from last year. I think we're going to surpass that double, actually. We did around 2,000 incidents in 2019, and we're approaching almost 4,000 already in 2020. A couple of big themes, ransomware, obviously. I don't know if you all have been noticing, a lot of the FBI notifications in the last 24, 48 hours against healthcare organizations in the United States. That's actually not a new trend. We saw, a lot of those attacks earlier in the year, and now we're seeing them mature again and going through another whole cycle of doom and destruction against hospitals. And I can't stress the timing of it is really, really bad. A lot of these hospitals are actually on the upward tip on response around COVID, and having, disruption in all of their IT infrastructure at the same time it's life-threatening, period. There's no other way to put that. We're actually engaged in a number of those victims at the moment. It is as bad as the FBI and the rest of the organizations are saying. So, from a ransomware perspective, it's pretty awful. I also say that the ransomware attacks are much more lucrative this year in particular. A lot more insurance companies are paying. So these attacks aren't going anywhere, and they're just going to get worse. It's a good financial model for the attackers and a really bad financial model for the victims. So we can talk more about the technical components of those, but it's pretty awful. Business email compromise, again, there's nothing new there. We're still seeing an upward tick on email compromises. O365 is a gift that just keeps on giving.
Mhm.
Keep seeing those breaches every single day. And then lastly, we do see a lot of the commodity attacks against infrastructure. So we're seeing a lot more services in cloud being targeted specifically, and then also denial of service attacks. So some of the oldies but the goodies are still around, and even in the last few weeks, we've seen a pretty big uptick in denial of service attacks against customers around globally. And again, it has an extortion component, but we see all of those things. My biggest concern is that the volume is just increasing. It's not decreasing, and the ability for organizations to actually withstand one of these attacks, or even have the security components to detect or prevent initially, it's pretty bad. Most organizations just aren't ready for even the most basic attacks that we're seeing these days. So it's
Yep.
really great, Rob. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, Mike, from your, give us your perspective from the MDR side of things. What's your perspective on that?
Sure. Well, Dan paints such a rosy picture, so I'll go ahead and try to lighten the mood a little bit. So that's what we're seeing in the way of attacks and threat actors and campaigns out there. Switching a little bit over to the technology side, on the plus side, we are seeing a significant increase in functionality and maturity within security platforms, with a real focus, especially within the last year or two, in actionable threat hunting within the individual platform. So that's really good. The downside of that is it does highlight what everybody already knows is we have the growing skills gap, and we really have a shortage of candidates throughout the entire industry. So there's the good and the bad. We have the tools, we just need the people to wield them. We are seeing a trend, and it's encouraging, of companies starting to seriously evaluate their endpoints and their cloud protections. So that's definitely steps in the right direction. Finally, we're seeing a significant increase in companies that are actually moving over to managed solutions, so MDR practices. And we see that both prior to and more often as a result of a cybersecurity incident. Hopefully, as we move forward, we can kind of switch that ratio and start putting this MDR practice in play before those events. Back to you, Rob.
Yeah, I'll echo what Mike is saying. We're seeing customers that have taken it seriously have the ability to survive.
Yeah, so 2020 has definitely been a unique year. So with that being said, is what has been like from in the security space today with 2020 specifically? What are the some of the challenges that you guys are seeing now, remote workers, things like that? So Mike, I'll start with you and then kind of get your feedback as well, Dan.
Sure. So you kind of hit the nail on the head when it comes to remote workers, and everybody is experiencing the same problem, some far worse than others. So a lot of organizations were kind of prepped and ready to go to a remote workforce, and it wasn't too much of a switch to be able to go full remote. Where we saw a lot of difficulty with this is certain organizations or certain divisions and groups within larger organizations. So I'll focus on one: call centers. That's hugely problematic when it comes to taking those, moving them out of the office space and into remote work. Many of them are on legacy platforms, legacy devices. A lot of them operate on thin terminals. And so if we even want to go with a full-fledged EDR solution for those, some of them can't actually support it. Traditionally, those are in-house. They rely much more heavily on firewall protections. And then finally, when it comes to the VPN solutions, those types of divisions or those types of resources aren't really factored into the work from home model. So a lot of companies obviously had to scale up. At best, it took companies a little bit. They had to scramble. But kind of at its worst, we saw cases where companies were deploying VPN solutions that were end of life, that had literally been pulled off of the shelves. They had already been decommed, and they were putting them back into service. Now, obviously, the end of life and end of support they're already vulnerable and they're not going to be protected. But then we saw this kind of flood of rushing to get those services out. So we saw a configuration that was, improper protections, no MFA, no identity and identity-based policies, really rushing that. The worst part about that is these systems were critical day one. So as soon as they were out there, as soon as they were deployed, they were the absolute critical aspect of the company. And so getting those patching, getting that maintenance, or getting that migration to a more permanent solution has been hard for every company, because they're going to have to take that down. And so that's kind of the trend that we've seen: rapid deployment of underprotected solutions, and then having to maintain those.
Cool. So, Dan, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say I'll echo everything Mike said, but I'll also add cloud into that sort of conversation.
Yeah.
We saw a lot of customers rush deployments into the cloud, especially Office 365, but then also Azure-based services or AWS or Google. It didn't really matter which cloud or which platform. That wasn't as relevant. What was really relevant is that customers had no clue what they were doing and basically just forgot security and just said, we got to get there tomorrow. Let's get it up and running. And running with test as a username and password is typically not a good idea. So we see that every single day, especially that rush to the cloud. Planning and making sure that you have a cohesive strategy on how you're going to manage and move to the cloud, vitally important. So it's, I know that there's a time crunch, but at the same time, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot if you just move so quickly that you don't know what you're doing. And really encourage folks to work with partners in that space to try to shorten that window of discovery and understanding, because without it, you're really going to shoot yourself in the foot.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, let's talk about, let's kind of get into the meat of what we're here to talk about today, which is MDR. So, last year, both you guys talked about the anatomy of a cyber, incident response, the steps, the tactics, how did they get into the networks, that type of stuff. It was a well-attended show, but this year, I think what we wanted to do is, let's talk more on the prevention side of things, like what could have been done, those types of things. So from that perspective, let's just at a high level, and then we'll kind of get down into the nitty gritty of the components of MDR and things like that. But just at a high level, and Dan, I'll start with you this time. So, the components of MDR, high level overview of MDR in your, from your perspective.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, MDR really is a management framework to be able to get visibility and control of your network in a more automated way, right? So utilizing all of the next generation API capabilities of all these wonderful products to be able to get scalable, repeatable processes and procedures that can cross product boundaries, network boundaries, cloud boundaries, application boundaries, and be able to react to events in a much more cohesive and automated way to both get efficiencies in operation, but also headcount reduction at the end of the day. But really, at the end of the day, it gives you just two things: visibility and control across the entire platform, the entire world. And having that management plane with really skilled analysts really gives you that fighting chance. So that's sort of my definition of MDR. And I actually put an H in there. I say manage, detection, hunt, response. I like putting the hunt. It doesn't roll off the tongue as well, but I really do want to add the H into the D and the R. I'm not quite sure what it actually, what acronym it can come up with. We've got to get a better name for it. But anyway, the H is actually really important, the hunting. We're seeing it actually pay off really handsomely, especially for living off the land attacks and administrative access kind of events. So as you're looking through MDR players, the hunting component is equally important to the detection and the response components.
Sure. So Mike, from an MDR or MSP perspective, what are your thoughts there, high level?
Sure. So if I'm keeping it at high level, probably the biggest thing about MDR would be it's a defense in depth strategy. So, it's not a one platform fits all or one size fits all. It, as Dan said, it's really about utilizing multiple platforms, having them work together, but then also understanding that you have to leverage them separately as well. This comes to utilizing the security platforms each to their fullest capacity, and that's something that we don't always see, and so that's a bit of a problem. When you're dealing with problems and alerts and events at the endpoint, what better platform to use than the EDR solution that makes up that MDR? And so really, and the same goes for the edge, the same goes for the cloud. So while in an MDR strategy, you're really trying to look at a single console and understand what's going on, it's only a starting point. You really have to be a master of each one of those individual solutions. And yes, I agree with Dan, definitely work on that integration so that you get your event correlation, you can get a better picture, but understand that with an MDR in that type of framework, you're going to have to be a master of each one of those solutions. And then finally, from an MDR perspective, it's managed. I mean, there's the M. You're outsourcing to an MDR provider that has that experience, that has that skill set, that 24/7 coverage. Very important aspect, that has the partnerships with those vendors and those providers to effectively manage detection, response, hunting, as Dan said. And to take it a bit further, it's not just managed in that. I've heard this a few times where MDR is that managed detection, that managed response, and light touch. I disagree with that. When it comes to a full MDR play, we consider that to be turnkey management of those protection platforms. So those that EDR, that firewall set, those cloud protections, they have to be managed. If they're not, it just kind of falls flat. You don't have your ongoing tuning. You're not going to keep those systems up to date and working effectively.
Yeah. I'll add one last thing there. And I think there's a really tight coupling between the customer and the partner or the vendor, whoever's involved in the delivery of an MDR. You really need to have a real two-way dialogue with customers. And it's not just throw an alert and respond to something. It's really also consultative, right? Making sure that the customer or whoever's involved in the management of the systems fully understands that maybe there's a better way. Maybe we need to set a setting or a configuration, or we see an alert that continues to happen, and tune it properly and make sure that the entire system is working as intended. That's really, really, really important, because it's a continual exploration of those settings. It's never just a fire and forget that everything is, you click one button and everything, you're secure. No, you have to go through this iterative process of continual evolution around security controls. And that's, I think, one of the most important components is that brushing your teeth part of making sure that your security is evolving literally hour by hour instead of just a stagnant click a button.
I mean, to me, it sounds like, there's things that are failing here. So it sounds like that the way that security has been done in the past and the way things are kind of evolving and changing today, there's a different way that we need to approach security. So from what you guys are saying with, the approach to MDR and things like that, why are some of these strategies folks have in place right now failing? I'll start with you, Dan, and then Mike, feel free to jump in there. Why is some of this failing?
Because humans are slow piles of, or bags of water. They're completely useless in compute speed analysis. I mean, if you put a human into the critical path for any thing that's operating at compute speeds, nano, micro, second, you're going to fail, because it just takes too long for humans to make a really good informed decision. So what we're seeing is, these attack life cycles, we're definitely closing the window if you have a good security posture, and we're getting down to now, the dwell time is now getting smaller and smaller and smaller under, good hygiene, security hygiene. But that window needs to get down to a Lambda function, right? Or a compute cycle, just, one cycle. And that's much more difficult for any human to really put into a process or a procedure. So yes, we're closing the dwell time. Yes, we're closing, the capabilities of the attacker, but we're still too slow. And our intention is to build systems that can do this at the runtime, moment, to add additional security and capabilities and visibility and control that drives everything from a compute cycle all the way to an email delivery, all of those sort of different methods of dealing with these attacks. But it's really the humans right now that are just too damn slow. Patch cycles are too slow. Application development times are too slow. We're too slow.
So I'm hearing gaps. So it sounds like there's some gaps in what folks are doing. Mike, it might be good for you to kind of step in here. So, what are some of these gaps? Where are we having some of these problems?
Sure. So I agree, and I agree with everything that Dan just mentioned. When it's left down to the human, that response time is far too great. The other thing that we're seeing is exactly what you hit on, Rob. Gaps in coverage. When we talk about MDR, we talk about defense in depth. We talk about layering security, and so the reason why that works and current solutions are failing is because they don't have that layering. They don't have those multiple avenues of protection. They have gaps in security, and that could be gaps in technology, coverage, visibility, and obviously we always come back to the staff and skill set. So a couple of examples there, and Dan, jump in if you'd like. If you're talking about, when I talk about technology gaps, the current solutions that we have in place or that companies have in place are just not working. When we talk about the endpoint protection, we find a lot of times that it's the platform that people have the most faith in, and possibly the most misplaced faith, given the solution and given the legacy nature of it. So when you're talking about traditional AV solutions, yes, it's great. It's deployed at all the endpoints. You have, ubiquitous coverage supposedly, but they're not cutting it anymore. They're traditional, they're based on traditional IOCs. They're looking for known hashes. They're looking for signature-based prevention only. It's not based on behavior. It's not based on activity. And that's what protections need to be based off. It needs that machine learning. It needs that intelligence to determine, okay, something's happening or multiple benign activities are happening in unison. I need to look at the bigger picture and determine that that's a problem. And those are, the current EDR solutions that make up EDR are going into that. And it's not just at the endpoint level; it's at the edge as well. We see capability problems or functionality problems at the edge, at the firewall solution when it comes to not being able to do TLS inspection or not using data loss prevention, not having DNS trapping. All of those features that you would have at the endpoint, they need to be at the edge as well. And then, something that we see constantly is these solutions without an integration to an extensive shared collected threat intelligence. There's far too much going on in the world to not be able to take in that information, that collected information, and actually put it to good use. So when I talk about technology gaps, that's really what we're referring to. Like I said, Dan, feel free to add any if you'd like.
Well, I would say email is still, when I started this conversation, there's two things that we find, happening almost every single case that we're working on. The first one is email securities are lax. So, running E3 or E5 is fine, but it isn't enough. I mean, just is not enough. You must have another layer of security controls on top of E3 and E5 on email, be it an external MX or additional cloud-based SaaS kind of offering around email protection. You can't just rely on Microsoft to filter those messages or protect you against those messages. So it's vitally, vitally important. And then I think, again, so many people are putting so much trust into Microsoft that they think it's a managed service, right? They get so used to not having hardware and software to manage. They assume that Microsoft is going to be doing the basic security controls, but they're not. It's up to you still. You're still responsible for the application configuration. You're still responsible for the content of this program. And you need to be careful, right? And then the other one is Active Directory, right? So we keep seeing this over and over and over again, is that you put all of your golden eggs into these worlds, and then you forget about them and you just assume everything's hunky-dory. But with AD security in particular, it is absolutely vital that you go through an audit or additional controls or have additional visibility into those systems, because that's how these guys are getting around inside of your network. They're laterally moving with Active Directory. And it's not just on your PCs and servers, they're now going into cloud infrastructure too. So those two subject matters in particular, they're not evolving security controls around it. And it really requires both a consultative, role to be able to architect and design it correctly, and then a monitor and detect and respond in those worlds to make sure that you can actually, deal with events as they occur. Yeah, AD, man, yeah, every single ransomware this year had an AD component, all of them, period.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I think we can mimic that as well. So we agree with that from our perspective also. But what I'd like to do is I'd really like to get into the meat of kind of what we're really here to talk to today, and that is kind of the nuts and bolts of MDR. I'd like to talk about the individualized components that make up MDR, and get your all's take as far as, let's talk about each component that makes up MDR, and what your thoughts are on the strategy of implementing this. And I'll start, Mike, on your side. Let's kind of get what are the nuts and bolts? What are those components of MDR? And then Dan, feel free to jump in on each one of these components, and we'll kind of work through those individually. So.
Okay, so we talked about MDR at a high level. Like you said, we'll take it down into the weeds a little bit. Dan said this earlier. I'm going to go ahead and just reiterate. First and foremost, it's not a product. It's not a platform. It's a strategy. It's a security framework as to how to best protect your company using multiple platforms of protection to not only provide protection, but also that high level of visibility, each individual platform. Now, when we talk about those platforms specifically, those protection platforms, we're talking about an EDR solution, so a true endpoint detection and response. We're talking about next-gen on-prem firewall solutions, edge security, and threat prevention. And we're talking about cloud security. So we're talking about virtual firewalls deployed in your cloud environments, your CASBs, all of your cloud protections. So what we do is we take those individual platforms. Like I said, they all have their capabilities. We use them to the fullest, but we take those events, those logs, those alerts, and then we do funnel those into a central console. And I think, and Dan, weigh in if you'd like, but when it comes to the central console and when it comes to MDR as a whole, one of the things to understand is, yes, you need a central console to look at. You need some place to correlate your events and understand what's going on. But a key aspect to MDR is understanding that's a starting point. You go from there. If you start to pull on that thread and you find that it takes you down to the EDR platform, that's where you follow it. If it takes you over to the edge security, you do that. If it takes you to cloud, you look there. You look in your cloud app security, you look in your CASB, so on and so forth. So you take all of that together, those solutions, that central console, and then it's what you would expect. It's round-the-clock coverage, immediate response to high severity alerts, and then continuous hunting and analysis around those lower levels or those mid-level alerts, as well as running automated and human-driven activities to hunt out those threats that are lurking just beyond triggering alerts. I'll go ahead and pause there. Dan, do you want to go ahead and jump in? I don't want to steal all the thunder.
I think I'd like to give like an example, right? So we just recently had a case with a customer that's an MDR customer. And here's sort of the workflow that occurred. Inside of our MDR system, we got an alert, and the alert said, hey, we blocked this file, or we blocked this user from typing in his username and password into a phishing site. So we then asked the platform, okay, automatically, this is all automatically occurring. well, where did that link come from that he clicked on that would lead him to type in his username and password? And the EDR told us it came from email. Oh, great. Well, let's look at the email. So we look at the email and we see that it went to 75 people. Now we ask ourselves, did anybody else click on that email? So then you go ask the system, either email or the EDR, or there's a lot of different places you could ask this question. Hey, did anyone else click this email? If so, follow the logic to make sure that they didn't type in their username and password, number one, or number two, did it get blocked like it was supposed to? But let's assume that nobody clicked on it and everybody didn't type in their username and password and it was blocked, everything's great. Well, you could also go quarantine that message and say, remove it from all mailboxes right this second. And you can tell Office 365 to go remove that message. Now, historically, that whole process just takes hours typically, right? Because now if you were to do this manually and touch 70 endpoints to see if someone actually clicked on a message and typed in the username and password, you're just going down 70 rabbit holes to be able to make sure. Well, now programmatically, all of that can be done automatically. We can iteratively check everything. We can remove the message. We can quarantine the message. And maybe we could even put in an access list or a URL filter to block that URL from ever being accessible for anybody else. And then we can actually share that threat intelligence with other folks and do additional intelligence around that URL or that email. And we can tell a story to say, hey, that was a campaign against, well, I don't know, you're going to a conference this year and you got a conference email and the conference email was spoofed. And maybe we can tie that back to a threat actor and we can say, it's being targeting, a specific vertical. And maybe it was specifically targeting individual users. And now you've got this big story around that one event that gives you context to say, okay, I need to train my users that if they're going to conferences, maybe don't trust that email just blindly. You might want to check to make sure you're registering a real website where you're going to a conference. So, it helps tell that entire story, but it also shortens that window, right? Because that window is what takes so long historically. It just took hours and hours and hours. Now it takes a few minutes to unravel that entire story.
That's a good point. Sorry, Mike, you're going to talk?
Yeah. So I'll actually rewind that a little bit and get back to one of the earlier points. So Dan's absolutely right as far as what the response needs to be. And this kind of gets back to one of those key factors within the MDR framework is that protections are no longer enough. So we know that the breach is eventually, regardless of the protection, the breach is eventually going to happen. As unfortunate as it is, they're going to find a way in. And so that comes, you've bypassed those protections, possibly those layers of protection. Everything that Dan just said started with visibility of it happening. And so that's really one of the huge focuses there. We can no longer be in a mindset of protection only. And that's a mindset that, that we preached years ago. And, if I'm being completely honest, if somebody said, okay, well, you can either protect or you can have visibility, I'll take protection all day long. But I'll also be the first to tell you that eventually you're going to have a really bad day because they're going to get through. And, as Dan's talking about it, we're talking about the benefits of that visibility, seeing that activity, and then being able to start the hunt around what has happened. And that's not just, seeing those users and seeing what happened, but that's, we see last year when we presented, we have multi-stage attacks. We have that dwell time, even if it's being reduced now. That visibility is so key to see what happens after the initial breach, after the initial compromise, as to how can we pick up the pieces? How can we stop it from really snowballing into something, a lot bigger? We actually worked with Checkpoint, a different example. We worked with Checkpoint, I think just a month ago, with a particular client that was, they had visibility in place. So they were doing things right. They had preventions in place and they were bypassed, but they also had visibility. And so therefore they were able to see there was some activity that they needed to call attention to. And That's what saved them from a single compromised machine, compromised account, to a full-blown ransomware company-wide. And so it's absolutely critical. I just, like I said, based off Dan's conversation, I just wanted to kind of go down that road a little bit.
Cool. So let's just, since we're talking about the nuts and bolts of MDR, both of you guys are talking about, like, multiple components, multiple platforms, things of that nature. In the market, there are providers out there that have a single platform. This, they're selling this holy grail of, the single platform approach from that perspective. Help me and help the folks that are listening to today understand the differences. Maybe I'll start with you, Mike, and then Dan, or whoever wants to start first.
Sure. When you talk about a single platform, there are ones out there where it's touted as a single platform, single agent. And really what we're talking about is a great, or potentially great, MDR solution, or sorry, EDR solution, where you have the endpoint agent and you have that funneling up to a dashboard where you get a lot of insight and you can do threat hunting activity, and you have that. In all the instances where I've seen that packaged as MDR, that's what they're selling, it's a managed solution around an EDR. And while that's great, and it's an incredibly important aspect of MDR, it's one piece. And so from our definition, it doesn't really fit MDR. It's, like I said, a managed EDR solution. Anything you want to add, Dan?
Yeah, I think the reality of the marketplace is very different than a single data source, right? Or a single data lake, if you will. If you look at the market, Microsoft has Sentinel, Google has Chronicle, AWS has their product set, Splunk has theirs, Elastic has theirs, and there's 5 or 10 other players in the space where their ecosystems are driven by these data repositories. And the days of moving everything to a central location like a SIM or something like that, those are over. People don't want to move petabytes worth of data around. They just want to be able to programmatically interface with whatever they want, right? They want the freedom of it. So I really do subscribe to the notion that each world, be it Checkpoint or Microsoft or whoever, will have their systems, but those systems will need to cooperate with each other and interface with each other in a holistic way. And the MDR needs to bridge the gap between all of those worlds, which also means that you need to be experts in all of them, which is also not so trivial. But the point, though, is that you're never going to get all of the data to a central repository anymore. You're going to have 100 repositories all over the map, and you need to be able to interrelate security events and even hunting activity across those lakes in a much more dynamic way. And I think that's really the future that I'm seeing. And the players that can do that are the ones that are going to be ultimately more successful. But don't ship data to a central place anymore. If it's not necessarily a round peg in a square hole, right? It's just it's too darn hard to do that these days, and it's just too costly.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, so those folks that are out there talking about SIM solutions and SIM is dead and all this other type of stuff, Mike, what are your thoughts on that?
So years ago, SIM was supposed to be the holy grail. It's you funnel everything up to it. You get all of your intelligence. It's your one-stop shop. It's your single console. And that didn't pan out. It just didn't work. And, as Dan said, it's so much harder now with just the sheer amount of data that we have. And lately, things have switched to the whole SIM is dead conversation. The way that we look at it is it's kind of SIM needs to be redefined as to what it's good for. And so, I talked about earlier, we still use SIM within the solution, but it's far different from, like I said, the traditional aspect or the traditional idea of what it's supposed to be used for. So we use it as an alarm collection point. It's a single point where, those individual platforms that really hold the keys to the kingdom, they send their alerts up, they send their basic information up. That way you have a console, you know where to start. But again, as I said before, that's what it is. You have to use it as a single point to start from to run your investigation, and then you pull your thread and see where it leads. So I'll agree with Dan. You don't send your data there anymore. You can use it for what it's good for, and you can use it as a collection point to start your investigations. So again, I don't really think that it's. I definitely don't think it's the Holy Grail. I don't think it's dead. I just think you redefine what you use it for.
One thing we've learned through this journey is that whatever platform you choose, so if it's Sentinel or Chronicle or AWS, or that doesn't matter as much where you put things, but the capabilities of those lakes, those data repositories is vital. So one of the big things as you're evaluating those data repositories are, can you put a rules engine in front of it? Can you put an alerting engine in front of it? Is there such a capability to create customized hunts and data searches? And the API-ness of those worlds is critical, absolutely critical, because if it's a legacy sort of repository, say a syslog repository or something like that, it is completely, utterly useless these days. It has to be an API. You have to be able to run rules against it. You need to be able to do hunts in that data. You need to have the alerting capabilities off those rules. And it needs to be 100% API where you're not transferring terabytes worth of data between systems. It needs to be very, very programmatic. So that's different, right? That's just a different way of working. But one thing we've also learned is that as you're doing hunting across those worlds, you need to have a standard vocabulary that you play by. And there's a couple of standard vocabularies that I highly, highly recommend. And we're just at the very beginning of this journey. We still have a ways to go. But so, for example, the MITRE ATT&CK framework is vitally important to some of this. Having common threat intelligence sources with understanding of indicators, critically, critically important. And with those standard vocabularies, ask those vendors to ensure that they have mappings to those tool sets. It'll save a significant amount of time and energy to be able to put together stories of these attacks. So there's some big asks with that data set, but most of the big vendors already are in that, supporting all of those worlds, but try not to use any of these, one-offs that say they can do everything, but in reality, they can't do much.
So I'm gonna put you guys on the spot. So I know you guys, I'm gonna ask you what ultimately from the sales side, when we're talking with customers that are out there and they talk about how expensive MDR is and buying all these components and rolling endpoints out to every, to every component within their organization, they're complex. Some things can be expensive. So, putting you guys on the spot, if I have limited budget and I want to invest in some components of the framework, give me one area where you see the most bang for your buck. Where would you put, if I can only afford one piece or one component, where are you going to do that? And I know you guys want everything and you button everything up, but from the reality of sales and what we are on the outside, I've only got limited budget. So where's my most bang for the buck, Dan?
Endpoint number 1, email number 2.
Okay, Mike?
Yeah, I'm not going to disagree with that. It is like you said, we preach the, we preach making sure that we have that defense in depth, but it's understandable. You do have to start someplace. And so absolutely, you've got to focus on your endpoints. First and foremost, you've got to focus on email as much as you can, taking the human aspect out of things. Now, the one thing that I'll add is, yes, you start with EDR, you start with email. You make sure you manage them correctly and ongoing. Because as Dan said earlier, that press the button once and expect it to run forever. It's not the case. So those are the platforms. The additional part to that is make sure you have some budget as well so that you can actually keep those things ongoing. Whether it's managed service provider or whether it's in-house, whatever the case may be.
All right. Well, that's good information. So we've got about 10, 15 minutes here. So let's kind of get to where we can kind of close things out from a standpoint of, I would like to put some components of MDR into my security posture. So, Mike, I'll start with you, but, how does a company start that journey? Where do they begin? What's the steps, that type of thing from that perspective?
Sure. Well, obviously, you've got to start by evaluating what you have, where you are in your, upgrade cycle. Take a look at the current posture that you have around those solutions. So what's your current EDR? What's your gateway solution? What's your cloud solution? Now, this can be done internally. It can be done with security posture assessments from a third party. And you'll get a good grasp on where you are from a technology as well as a visibility perspective. Then that's where the real fun part starts. And that comes down to, we talked about earlier, the skills gap and the security engineers within the space. Companies have to decide what they're going to own, what they're responsible for, what skill sets do they have, what do they want to maintain. And actually, that's the biggest part of it, is not just what skill sets you have in-house, but which ones you choose to maintain moving forward. A good example of that is every company, even security companies, have to make that determination. What are we good at? What do we want to own? We're an MDR provider, and there are aspects of security that we don't maintain in-house because it just makes more sense. That's why we leverage companies like Checkpoint, like Dan and his IRT team. And so that's what every company has to do as they start this journey, is figure out what they need to own, what they want to maintain. And then from there, they can start the discussions around what fits the best. We touched on it a little bit before, but when it comes to an MDR solution and an MDR provider, you really do have to have that partnership and understand which platforms are they leveraging, which ones are they recommending, and how does your solutions in your current platforms fit into that environment. If it's not something that they provide or that they lead with, they might not be the right provider for you, because you want to play to their skill sets and what they've determined is best suited. Yeah. Dan, I'll go ahead and kick over to you if you want to add to that.
I will just say that partners like rmsource are equally important for us. I think, just like you were saying, there are certain things that are best left to partners that are closer to the customer, that have a better relationship. So, we can provide the tools and the platform and, the skill set on the back end, but there's still a lot of interaction with the customer that's so vitally important. So the partners you choose to help you in this journey are critically important to getting efficiencies, right? So leading you down the path of not spending a lot of money on things that you really don't need, for example. That's a huge, value add that a decent partner that's not just looking for a transaction can provide. And that knowledge and the consultative approach is critically important. I think everybody's so strapped for budget these days. I get that. But the attackers don't see it this way. The attackers see your bottom line, they look at your cash reserve, and they go for you, right? And again, it's not that, the board needs to spend unlimited money, but they do need to really understand that they don't get out of jail free here. There's no freebie here, and there's no kicking the ball down the road. You literally have to do this, or you're going to be in a much worse shape, financially, or even from a reputation or a brand reputation. So it has this huge impact. But the key, though, is not to overdo it or underdo it. And that you need to invest, but you don't want to, overextend yourself either. So there's a lot of teetering between those two extremes and making sure that you are on the right journey there. But just don't think someone else is going to do it for you. They're not, unless you contract them to do it. You don't get security for free in the cloud. You don't get, free evolution. Evolution on the endpoint is something we struggle with every day, and we've talked about it. You've got to evolve, and having a good partner and a good strategy around that is critically important.
Yeah, definitely. So, I'd hope to maybe have a little bit of time there where we could, have a we could talk about an incident and kind of work it through the processes and, how MDR would cover all of that, but I think we're going to run out of time. So I guess what I want to close with both of you guys is, I think we have an understanding of MDR as a whole, what the components are, things of that nature, but what else should folks be doing for security? So in a closing statement here by each of you guys, are there other areas or other things that folks should be doing? And I just want to get your take on that before we close out the session here today.
At the end of the day, you need a program. You just need a program that isn't a one-time investment. It is a continual operational model that must evolve continuously. Mm-hmm. And if it's static and you think it's static and it's as simple as buying a product and installing it, you're never going to survive. So I think if there's one thing I would ask is, drive your management to have that mentality around it. And then the second thing is align it with business strategy. Don't just do it because it's a best practice. Obviously you want to do best practice, don't get me wrong, but you have to align it to what the business is up to. And you have to really understand what the drivers are, where the money's being made, where it's being lost, and understand how to apply the right controls and the right systems. So you don't just become a negative on the balance sheet, but actually a positive, and you can actually find opportunities to inject security without always being a cost center.
That's a good point. Mike?
Sure. So if we're talking about, in addition to MDR, there's a couple of things. One, from the actual security engineers within a company, or security director, CISO, really maintaining some kind of ongoing research, or at least ongoing, getting your eyes on threat intelligence. And so nothing happens in a vacuum. You do have to, the company, if they're going this alone or if they're working with a partner, you do have to stay up to speed on what's going on. Getting back to taking a look at, just weekly threat intelligence, mapping that to what we're seeing with the MITRE attack framework. Who are the adversaries? What are the bulletins being sent out? When do I need to be a little bit more on high alert than ever before? So that's first and foremost. The other thing is, we talk about the user in all of this equation, and we always talk about being able to eliminate some of that human error. The reality is it's a really hard thing to do, and we're going to continue to struggle with that, and the user is going to continue to be part of this. So from a company culture perspective and from an ongoing training perspective, it's actually, it's one of those easy things to say, do your security training. What we've found is it definitely has an impact. Funny story, we're a security company, we have to run it. So we ran security training, a series of it last year. And then after all COVID started, I was working remotely, and my wife came into the office. She was working right down the road, and so she came in real quick just to grab something, and she got stopped at the door by one of our engineers who wouldn't let her in the building, or wouldn't let her in the office space, because he thought it was a security test that I was running. And so so it works. If you get the message out there, people will be vigilant. If you continue that message, it really does have an impact. So when we talk about the user, let's include them. Let's understand that, we can, to some extent, rely on them, and we are going to need to work with them. We're not going to eliminate human error. So at least let's approach it from that front as well.
Yeah. It's a journey.
Yep. No, that's perfect. Well, Dan, I just wanted to close out by saying thank you for joining us today. It was good to get to talk with you, and Mike, I appreciate you joining the call and talking with everybody today. I hope this was insightful for everybody that joined. Please feel free to join us over at the exhibit. I know Mike has agreed to come over to the booth, so if you'd like to ask questions directly to him or anything like that, we'll be available here at the end. So. Thank you for the time. Rich, I guess I'll turn it back over to you. And I think we closed out right when we were supposed to.